100 million marks. That was the most German law allowed the central bank to lend its own government directly. 12 billion is what the Reich drew instead. And in form, nobody broke that law. They went around it. Through a company with 1 million marks of capital, no factory, no product, and almost no staff. Every mark of that 12 billion was billed in its name, and not one of them appeared in the Reich's budget. This is the paper that carried it. The ceiling was written into the bank law of 1924. Hyperinflation had erased German savings the year before. Why the ceiling was written is not settled by the record. What it did is not in doubt. On direct lending to the government, 100 million marks, as the Nuremberg prosecution recorded it. That was the wall. By 1933, the problem had two halves. The first was finding money beyond what taxes and public loans could raise. The second was harder, making sure that nobody outside a very small circle could see how much of it there was. The problem went to a man who was not, in 1933, a member of the party. His name was Hjalmar Schacht. A decade earlier, he had run the stabilization that ended the hyperinflation, and that made him the one person in Germany who could make this look like ordinary banking. What he used was not a printing press, it was a detour. A firm that made guns would deliver the state's order and, instead of being paid, would draw a bill. A promise to pay 6 months out. Exactly the kind German industry had traded for a century. But the bill was not drawn on the government. It was drawn on a company. The name was Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft. Metals Research in English. Take the first 2 letters of each word and you have what the paper was called ever after. Mefo. The prosecution described the firm in 4 words. Merely a dummy organization. Nominal capital, 1 million marks. So the manufacturer held a private company's acceptance, rather than a debt from the Reich. And standing behind it was a guarantee from the Reich itself, which appeared on no public account. The manufacturer took the bill to its own bank and was paid in cash. That bank took it to the Reichsbank and was paid in turn. But nothing in that chain was a forgery. A real company accepted the paper. A real bank paid out real money. The banks were not fooled either. The Reich guarantee was precisely why they took it. What no bank could see and no ministry could audit was the total. The transaction was never the secret. The sum was. So look at what had actually changed. The state's debt had become a company's acceptance, and the company was a nameplate. Nothing about it was illegal, and nothing about it was visible, which leaves the question the whole scheme turned on. How long can a promise to pay in 6 months be kept alive? The bills ran for 6 months. But written into them was a provision that mattered more than the maturity. They could be extended, 3 months at a time, one after another. Up to the 5-year limit the Reich had guaranteed. So for years, almost nothing came due. A 6-month bill, rolled forward again and again, became a 5-year note. That is how the tribunal put it. Guaranteed by the Reichsbank, and backed by nothing more than the Reichsbank's position as a bank of issue. The debt was put off, not paid. But rolling the paper forward only worked while nobody could add it up. So the concealment was built into the same design. There were 2 places those bills could have appeared, and they appeared in neither. Not in the published statements of the Reichsbank, and not in the budget figures. The amount outstanding was a guarded state secret. So consider who was reading those accounts. Foreign governments, trying to work out how fast Germany was arming, and finding a central bank that looked disciplined. German savers, ruined by inflation once already and watching for it to come back. And the Reich's own budget officials, who could not audit a number they were never shown. 12 billion marks. And that was on top of a declared debt that itself rose from 10.4 billion to 19 billion, dedicated, in the government's own words, as far as possible to the financing of armament and the 4-year plan. Mefo bills were not how Germany armed. They were the hidden margin on top. Be exact about the scale, because the scale is bad enough without inflating it. And what that margin helped arm was the state that invaded Poland in September 1939. That state started a war which killed tens of millions of people, and it murdered 6 million Jews. The paper was hidden. What the paper was for was not. That margin still had to come from somewhere. So Schacht went looking in stranger places. Inside the Reichsbank sat blocked accounts, frozen money owned by foreigners, people the regime counted as opponents. In May 1935, in a note to Hitler, he wrote that the bank had put most of the foreign money it could reach into arms bills. Then he wrote the line that damns him. Our armaments are, therefore, being financed partially with the assets of our political opponents. Read it again, because he was not confessing. He was reporting progress. In a memorandum. To Hitler. In writing. But a rolled-over debt is still a debt, and this one had a trapdoor. Every outstanding bill could be presented for discount, and when one was, the currency in circulation had to grow to cover it. Automatically. The prosecution's phrase for it is exact, an ever-present threat of inflation. So the man who had saved the currency had built something that quietly threatened it, and the threat grew with every extension. He had been arguing for limits himself since 1936. For financial reasons, the judgment is careful to say. Not moral ones. Some of his own directors told him to stop. In March 1937, he promised another 3 billion marks. So why keep going? The prosecution put its own answer in the record, and it is worth hearing as what it is, an accusation, not a finding. He continued, it argued, out of unswerving loyalty to Hitler, because he accepted the basic idea of National Socialism, and because he judged the disturbances irrelevant next to the size of the task. By the spring of 1938, the paper outstanding had reached 12 billion marks, more than 100 times what the front door allowed. So at the end of March 1938, the man who had built it turned it off. Schacht discontinued the practice himself. Part of the reason was financial. The evidence gives the other part, and it is the coldest line in this story. Mefo financing ended because it was no longer deemed necessary to conceal the vast progress of German rearmament. Hiding had stopped being useful. And 8 months after he switched it off, he stood up and praised it. In a speech in November 1938, "It is possible," he said, "that no bank of issue in peacetime had carried on such a daring credit policy since the Nazis took power. With the aid of it, Germany had created an armament second to none. And that armament, in turn, had made possible the results of our policy." 9 months after he said that, those results included Poland. In the first week of January 1939, he handed Hitler a report signed by the directors of the Reichsbank. It demanded deep cuts in arms spending and a balanced budget as the only way to prevent inflation. Later that month, Hitler removed him from the presidency of the bank. But removing the man did not remove the limit. In June, they removed the limit. The bank law of 1924 was repealed outright, and the ceiling on lending to the Reich became a single clause. The amount would be whatever Hitler decided. The new law kept one ceiling, 200 million marks for the post office and the railways. In 1946, the record put him in the dock at Nuremberg. The tribunal noted that he had been an active supporter of the party before it took power, and that he had backed Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. In January 1937, he had accepted honorary membership of it and the golden swastika. Then it wrote the 2 sentences that matter, that Schacht was a central figure in German rearmament, and that the steps he took in the early days of the regime were responsible for how fast Nazi Germany rose as a military power. Then it acquitted him. Rearmament by itself, the tribunal held, is not a crime under the charter that created the court, and it could not establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Schacht knew the arms he financed were meant for a war of aggression. On that count, he walked. A German denazification court later convicted him and gave him 8 years in a labor camp. He was out by 1948. His own concession, put in evidence against him, was that the device enabled the Reichsbank to lend by a subterfuge to the government what it normally or legally could not do. A subterfuge, his word, not the tribunal's. So this is what the Detour bought before it bought a single tank. It bought a description, The money would have moved either way. What changed was what the books said about it, and that decided who could argue. Move the spending into a company that never appears in the accounts. Call the guarantee something other than debt. The arithmetic does not change, the oversight does. 1,000,000 marks of capital. 12 billion in paper. 100 million was the direct limit, and it was never repealed while the scheme ran, because it never needed to be. It was routed around, using a company with a nameplate and a stack of 6-month bills that nobody was allowed to count. What they bought was the army that invaded Poland. And the war it started killed tens of millions of people. This is the small picture show.